Alright folks, so today you'll be watching your first vodcast for the year. Within this vodcast we will be looking at the earliest humans that were found in the world, and in your textbook this would be called Chapter 1, Section 1, Understanding Our Past. But basically we're going to look at how we know about the earliest humans in the world, how do we know where they lived, what they did, how they lived, and how do we figure those types of questions out. So within this vodcast we have 5 lesson objectives, and basically what that means is these are the 5 things that you will be able to do or should be able to do when you are done watching this vodcast. Remember, you can pause, you can rewind as the vodcast is playing if there's something that you don't understand or you missed and you need to go back and look at again. So our first lesson objective is to define prehistory. Right, so you'll be able to say and come up with a definition for what prehistory is. Our second lesson objective is to describe some ways that historians study the past. So how do we know about things that happened a couple thousand years ago or a couple hundred years ago or even 10 years ago? How do we know about those things? Right? Historians have ways to study things from the past. We can't get into a time machine and go back a couple thousand years ago, but we do have some methods, some ways that we can look at things from the past and figure out what was going on at the time. Our third objective is to explain these two specific types of historians, these two specific types of history called anthropology and archaeology. So we'll look at those two things and you'll be able to understand what those are. We will also be able to describe the methods used to determine the age of remains and artifacts. So historians, anthropologists, archaeologists, one thing that's pretty important for them when they're looking at things from the past is to figure out how old they are. So there are a couple different methods that they use to do that. You'll be able to describe 2 of those methods. And lastly, the last lesson objective for today is to be able to explain the migrations of early modern humans. So where did humans begin? Where did they migrate to? What would that have looked like? How would that have worked? So to our first learning objective, which is to define prehistory. Right? If we take a look at this little cartoon here, we have a couple cavemen who are apparently staring at a wheel that they just created and made, and one is saying to the other, the hard part will be writing the tutorial. Now, humans lived on Earth for thousands of years and did a lot of things, like inventing the wheel, before they were able to write. So prehistory is going to have to deal with when people learned and were able to start writing things down. Right, about 5,000 years ago or so, some civilizations began keeping written records. Remember, not everyone was able to write at the same time. It happened at different times in different parts of the world. But roughly 5,000 years ago or so, some civilizations were able to start writing things down. They came up with that ability to be able to record things and write things. This is the beginning of recorded history. Right, since people are recording things down that they can go back to later and look at again, we call that recorded history. Humans had existed for thousands of years before this, literally tens of thousands of years before anybody had started writing things down, recording things. This period of time is known as prehistory. Right? Prehistory is everything before humans were able to write. So in order to study prehistory, historians cannot read anything. Right? Everything we know about them we know from looking at things we have found. Right, not from writing. So we look at the timeline that I have here, prehistory versus recorded history. Okay, writing develops roughly around 5,000 BC or so, depending on what culture, what civilization you are in the world. Everything before that was called prehistory, referred to as prehistory. Everything after writing develops we refer to as recorded history. Now, if we go to our second lesson objective, which is to describe some ways that historians study the past. So how do we figure out about things that happened so long ago? Right? When you read textbooks, when you watch videos created about history, how do the people that created those things, that wrote those textbooks, know about what happened? So we'll look at how this works. I'll give you a second to just look at this cartoon and think about what it's showing you. All right, so Pretty simply, this makes sense. Historians study history, so they study the historical past. Right? They look at what happened previously and try to figure out exactly how that worked, or as best they can how it worked. One way that we can do that, one way that historians are able to do that, is by looking at artifacts. And artifacts are anything, they are objects made by humans. Right? Things that humans made that did not occur naturally. Things like clothing, coins, certainly made by humans, pottery, anything that was made by a human being and we find and we look at is called an artifact. Our third objective is to explain anthropology and archaeology. These are two specific types of history. If you are looking at the poster that's in the background there, you probably recognize a few of the characters. They are from the Indiana Jones movies. In the Indiana Jones movies, main character Indiana Jones is an anthropologist. Now, most anthropologists do not have the exciting, adventurous life of Indiana Jones. It's not as exciting as that, but anthropologists, just like Indiana Jones does in the movies, does study culture, does study cultures from the past. Now, anthropology, all it is the study of human culture. Right? If you were looking at humans and what they do and what they act like, you are an anthropologist. Now, if you take a look at this cartoon, you see a couple of people showing up to work. 3 of them are dressed in a suit and tie. Apparently, part of the company culture is to dress up, to wear a suit and a tie to work every day. Apparently, though, one of the characters, Perkins, does not know or understand company culture. He shows up in a stupid-looking t-shirt. Culture can be as simple as what you wear. Right? Culture refers to the ways of life of a society. So again, for example, what you wear, the jewelry you wear, the clothing that you wear, differs from culture to culture. This person from the Maasai tribe in Africa dresses much differently than we do. Right? That is part of culture. Religion is certainly part of culture. Right? Your religion is different than somebody from a different part of the world, most likely. Language is a really important part of culture. Right? Thank you, merci, gracias. These are 3 ways to say the same exact thing, but the way that you say them and the way that they sound differ from culture to culture. Right? Even music. Right? Music from groups of people to different groups of people are very different than one another. Right? What you listen to is probably much different to what this bagpiper is playing in Scotland. Now, one thing that is really important about culture that you guys need to understand is that you are not born with culture. Right? Rather, culture is handed down from one generation to the next through learning and experience. So you're either taught about your culture or you learn about your culture through witnessing it, through experiencing it. Language, for example. None of us were born speaking English. We learned how to speak English from our parents teaching us, and also from hearing English all the time from the other people around us, right, through experience. That is culture. Right? Culture is something that is handed down from generation to generation. Right? If we take a look at archaeology, archaeology is a specialized branch of anthropology. It is the study of past cultures through their material remains. So archaeologists are the guys and gals that dig stuff up. Right? They dig things up, look at them, and study those things to try and figure out what's going on in that civilization that they are looking at. Now, archaeologists have to figure out how old something is. That's one of the first things that they do when they dig something out of the ground, right? They got to figure out how old this is. If it's 10 years old, it's probably not that important to look at. But if it's 5,000 years old, then it's something they certainly want to look at more and try and figure out what it is and figure out what it means. Now, they use 2 methods to determine the age of remains and artifacts, right? At least 2 that we are going to look at. And then our 4th objective, that is to be able to describe those 2 ways of determining the age of or remains of artifacts. Now, the 2 ways are the relative dating method and the carbon dating method. Right? They both determine the age of different things. Relative dating, however, In relative dating, you are comparing how old something is to something else. So it determines whether material remains are older or newer than one another. You are comparing when you are using relative dating. Now, the main technique that archaeologists use with relative dating is simply by looking at how deep it was buried in the ground compared to something else. Typically, the deeper something is buried in the ground, the deeper you find it in the earth, the older it tends to be. The closer to the surface that it is, the younger it tends to be. That is not 100% true all the time, but most of the time, if it's buried deeper, it's older than something that's closer to the top. Now, with carbon dating, you get an exact age of the remains that you are looking at, the materials that you are looking at. It is used to determine the exact age. Right? And pretty much with carbon dating, it's gotten so good that you can determine the age, within a year of what its true age would be. All living things contain this element called carbon-14, and this element decays at a very set rate. It never changes. So when we look at it, the less carbon-14 there is present, the older the material. Now, it's kind of like algebra here, where if you have two knowns and one unknown, like x plus 6 equals 10, for example, we can figure out, because we have two knowns, what the unknown is, what the x is. Right? Same thing happens here. We know the half-life of carbon-14. We know the current amount of carbon-14 in the remains that we're looking at. And using those two things, we can figure out what the starting amount would have been and how old it would be. Now, since carbon-14 is only found in living things, this method can only be used on things that were once living. Right? If it is not something that was once living, you can't use carbon dating on it. Right? You'd have to use the relative dating methods to try and figure out how old it is. Right? So give you a few minutes here. You might want to pause it so you can look at these pictures. Look at every one of these pictures. Look at these artifacts or material remains, and figure out which method would you use. Right? Would you use relative dating, or would you use carbon dating to figure out how old these different things were? All right, and our last lesson objective for today was to describe the migrations of early modern humans. Now, we're going to look at this chart here showing our evolution. Before modern humans, before us, there were dozens of human-like animals that lived on the face of the earth, all of which at some point became extinct. We are the only humans that are still living, okay, and are living on the face of the earth. Okay? All others did become extinct. Now, modern humans, right, early modern humans, by looking at the material remains and looking at the artifacts and different things that we have found, the oldest of those remains and artifacts have been found solely in Africa, right, particularly in the central eastern part of Africa near this place called the Great Rift Valley. From there, over thousands of years, humans eventually moved to other parts of the world, right? So gradually into northern Africa, from northern Africa to the Middle East and Europe, from there to Asia, eventually Australia, and then even North America and South America. This took tens of thousands of years to occur and would have happened very slowly over a very long period of time. So that concludes today's vodcast. Remember, you can pause, you can rewind, you can watch this 20 times if you would like, to make sure you understand what's going on in class. All right. Please make sure that you filled in your guided notes as you were watching this, and you are prepared to what we're doing in class. Right? What we're doing in class tomorrow is going to deal with everything that you have seen in this vodcast today. All right. Hope you guys enjoyed it. See you guys tomorrow.